Welcome back. It is another Master Game Analysis day today in our quest to win the Canberra Chess Club Championship of 2023, and in general, just to improve at chess, to enjoy chess, and to appreciate it. Now, I had a request from one of the subscribers to this channel to analyze a game by Emory Tate, who was an international master, and that's what we're going to do today. In this game, Tate was playing against someone called Mariano, and this was played in 2009. Now, the reason I chose this game, which is the first game played by Tate that I've ever seen, is because it's in an opening that I am using at the moment. And that opening is e4, knight f3, and bishop b5, which characterizes the Roy Lopez. But after a6, where the very, very most popular move is to drop the bishop back, instead to actually exchange the bishop for the knight, the so-called Roy Lopez exchange. And because I like this opening and use it myself, mostly the reason I like it is because it is less popular, so people tend to be a bit less prepared for it. That's why I chose this game of Tate's to look at. Now, the first thing that I'm going to do is just give my thoughts. And the first thought that comes to mind is this move b3 that Tate now plays. It makes a lot of sense, fianchettoing the bishop to b2 so you can put pressure on this pawn. Now, in case you're not aware, the reason that black takes this pawn, takes the knight this way, and the reason you can't just take this pawn straight away is because then black can play this move, which attacks the knight and also attacks this pawn. So if you move the knight away, you lose this pawn with a check, and black's doing just fine. Whereas if you try and defend the knight somehow, well, then you still lose the pawn with check. You're going to lose the next one as well. So it's for that reason that, you don't take this pawn immediately. What I normally do here is I actually normally just castle, and I get castled quickly. Oftentimes a player will play something like this, and I'll start pushing them away, and then I'll consider playing moves like this. And then either putting my knight out or putting the pawn up. That's how I tend to play this position. But as mentioned, Tate has gone with b3. Not a bad idea. In fact, a perfectly good idea. And we have here the opponent playing knight e7. Tate puts his bishop on b2 as previously telegraphed. Now we are threatening to take this pawn, as far as I can tell. And okay, so Mariano defends the pawn in a very solid way. No point really in taking twice here. Although you get 2 pawns for the knight, you only get 2 pawns for the knight. I suppose you could also argue that you've opened up the kingside position a little bit. And actually this might be an interesting approach. Maybe not though in a master level game, because if you're doing this against a master, and I'm not sure, but I suppose that Mariano playing against Emory Tate also was a master of some level, be it international or grand, I'm not sure. But yeah, while that's maybe something you could consider, it is much more natural to play what Tate played, which is d4, putting a pawn in the center to oppose this pawn. If you're going to take the pawn, it makes a lot more sense to take with a pawn, and when he takes back, well, then you can capture that second pawn as well. So this makes a lot of sense. And Sana actually does take, because it's a lot of pressure to bear on this pawn otherwise. You can't really defend it in any other way easily. I suppose another possible continuation may have been something like bringing the knight over here. The knight here, so that if takes, you can consider taking back with the knight, but the problem is there, at the very least, you can trade queens. It's black's turn to move. So maybe black would take, you take. If black then decides to take back like this, you take. And white's actually looking pretty good here. And so, yeah, because of all that pressure on the pawn, rather than trying to defend it in a way that will be awkward anyway, Sana just trades. So, and Tate here takes with the bishop. Now, I thought that was odd. I think it's a lot more natural here to take with the knight, or in fact, with the queen is probably what I would do. It develops another piece, for one thing. It's hard for this queen to be attacked by the knight because there's a pawn in the way. And if the pawn attacks the queen, well, We can simply take here. He's not got the right to castle anymore. We can rub that in his face by ourselves just castling, and this is a very comfortable looking position. The knight can come out next. The rooks will be connected. They can sit on the D&E files. Nothing to complain about. Maybe it's not winning, but it's certainly nothing to complain about. So that's probably what I would do, is I would take and play on from there. If he takes back, then I would take with the knight. I'd leave the bishop back in a supporting role. But hey, that's me. If this, at that point, well, now I suppose I would consider just probably, well, I'd drop the knight back, whether it's here or here, I'm not sure. But either way would be fine. And you'd play on from there. But no, Tate takes with the bishop, which is, to me, a bit unnatural. But also, I suppose, fine. And Sana follows up by pinning the knight. So the knight can't move now because, well, if it does, the queen's going to fall. So because of that, it's almost as though the queen is threatening to take the pawn. Not really, but, if this bishop has to move, or, if the queen here is called upon to capture this bishop, or to capture whatever captures this bishop, then this bishop will be able to take here and ruin the pawn structure. So that's why it seems a bit unusual to me. So what would I do in this position? I'm now pinned. I mean, instinctively you want to break the pin. You don't want to, you might want to play something like this, because now if he takes, you can take back with the knight and everything is nicely defended. The problem that I see with this move, however, is that you leave this bishop mostly undefended. I mean, it is defended, but it's only defended by a knight, which, if it moves, gives up a queen. But funnily enough, this is what Tate played. It's actually a very interesting move, because in order for this bishop to be taken, it has to be taken with the queen, which is what Sana did. And he's taken a bishop, but he's giving up his queen. So now Tate takes the queen, Sana takes Tate's queen, and at the end of the line, Tate takes back the bishop. So both have given away a bishop, both have given away a queen, but it was just a very nice kind of little tactical way of getting these trades happening. Take, giving a queen, but taking a queen, and then taking both bishops. And at the end, though, black has castled. This knight is now under attack. To me, the most natural response here would probably be something like this. So the knights both defend each other. You might have to be careful of something like this, but you don't have to be, I think, too careful. You can jump up here. The king always defends the rook. You're attacking this bishop now, which is, of course, defended, but position looks nice for white, I would say. But Tate does something different. Tate just jumps the knight up here straight away, hitting both the rook and the bishop, which I think is a very, very also nice and natural move. This knight here is defended multiple times, so that's perfectly fine. And you're basically saying move your rook, which, yes, Sana did do. Now, I suppose my most tempting move would be take the bishop. I'd be most tempted to take the bishop, because otherwise you're leaving black with a bishop. Your dark squares look like they've been weakened, so if it were me, I would take. But as we can see, that's not what Tate did. What Tate did, he just jumped the knight back. He jumped the knight back, maybe looking to either jump back into this hole at some point in the future, or maybe saying, if you ever push this pawn forward, then, again, there might come a future time where I can sit on this square, but I don't really think that's very feasible. So again, I wouldn't have played this way by jumping the knight back, but again, it is a very acceptable move. Maybe the knight's just going to come and sit here. Maybe it's going to come back here. There's options. So he's playing, I guess you would say he's playing in a way that's very flexible. He's playing in a way that's very flexible. Now, after knight g6, would I take this knight? My instinct says probably not. And the reason I wouldn't is because he takes back with the pawn, and now his rook has a lot of scope down this file. So, I'm likely to castle on my next move. Maybe he can engineer in the future a way, even maybe through something like this, attacking the pawn. If the pawns capture each other, now the rook's ready to swing over here, and you've got a bit of pressure here. The bishop can come here and put more pressure. I'm not saying it's going to be a mating attack or anything, but on instinct, why would I want to open up this file for him at all when I don't have to? I could defend this knight, or as mentioned before, I could jump it back in one of various different ways. What would I do? I think I realistically would probably jump back here, but we can see that's not what Tate did. What did Tate do? He jumped over to the side of the board. Now that you might have heard before, knights on the rim are grim. Now this knight, what's it doing? It's attacking a pawn, which is currently defended by the bishop. I suppose he therefore ties this bishop down, for if the bishop moves, well then he drops the pawn. And we can always then jump back here, and we're going to have a nice position. So I guess this does have the benefit of sort of cramping black and saying you can't move at the moment. You can't move the bishop anyway. Maybe you can move the rook here, and after you move the rook, let's say I castle, now you can move the bishop, and what's my knight really doing? Probably just going to have to come back at some point. But even here you can still see it's fine even if things go this way. Tate's position doesn't have any weaknesses. There's nothing wrong with it. You can do more or less whatever you want here as Tate. There's lots of different options. But that's not what we saw happen after this knight h5 move. Let's see. Knight h5, Sana moves the knight into an unusual square. It's not what I would have done. So see, if I were Sana here, I would have, like I said, played this move to protect the pawn and try and free my position. But playing this way instead just begs, I think, it begs f4 to be played. So why would we not play f4 here and just kick this knight off its perch? I can't see a reason not to play this move. Maybe he's going to come in here, and it looks like we are following the moves of the game. Now if we castle, which is not going to happen, I would say, because if you do castle, there's a fork on both rooks. So I guess that was Sana's idea, is f4, bring the knight here, and therefore prevents castles because of the fork that would result. But we can just guard this square instead, maybe something like king e2, which is in fact what Tate played. And now you kind of castle by hand. You can bring the rook over on the next move if you like, and your king is guarding the square that the knight would otherwise like to use. Maybe next you can play something like e3 and just push this knight away. It will be, kicked back into no man's land. So I don't really like the maneuver here that Sana played, but I think that Tate responded in a nice way. And an unusual way, because normally you would castle either short or long, but here Tate says, no, I'm just going to not castle. Even though the position is quite open, I'm going to leave my king right in the center, because that way I'm actually restricting your knight. Sana has a go at our knight. I think here there's nothing to do but bring the knight back home, unless you want to counterattack. But if you counterattack, he takes knight, you take knight, he takes pawn, you've lost a pawn. He's got a pawn in an annoying position. I think I would just drop the knight at this point. That's what Tate does. He brings the bishop in to attack this pawn. How would I deal with that? Well, I might say h3 first anyway, because after h3, where does this knight go? It can't come here with the bishop anymore where it is. So if you play h3, it doesn't look like there's any really safe square for the knight to actually go. So I think I would go h3, and then if he takes this pawn, that's the problem, is he takes the pawn, and after you take the knight, he also takes your knight. So we're not actually in time to play h3. We should defend this pawn first. We don't want to do it with this rook, because if we do it with this rook, I'll put this on the board. Well, then at the very least, you drop this pawn with a tempo against your rook. So any other ways we can defend this pawn? Well, one very aggressive way would be actually to move the king further up here. Now that would be interesting, because not only do you defend the pawn, but you attack the knight. And again, where does this knight go? I don't really see. Maybe he can come here and argue that if you take here, he's going to take here. And it's really just a knight for knight trade. But after you take the rook and he takes back, I would say you take the pawn as well. You've then got a passed pawn. And if he tries to attack it, well, you protect it. It's a protected passed pawn. So I kind of think that looks nice for white. And I would therefore say my suggestion here of king f3 isn't looking all that bad. He might therefore have to defend the knight with a move like this. But after takes, you're again threatening the knight. I suppose there the knight can move away, however. At that point, I think I'd probably move my other rook into the game, or possibly play a move like this and try and get trades, whether it's trades of rooks or whether it's trades of knights, but just basically to try and simplify a few things here. He doesn't have time to do that. So I think that probably would be what I would play in this position, is king f3, and I'm curious what the engine thinks about that. Actually, the engine likes king f3. It also likes rook f1, which was the other move in the back of my mind. King f3, maybe not quite as good from a computer's perspective, but also not bad. Tate did play rook f1, which is really the only other sensible move, defending the pawn without dropping this pawn. Your king now, however, is tied down to the defense of this knight. And you don't attack this knight either, although you perhaps keep in reserve the option of h3 coming up shortly. But this pawn is now defended. Now we have b5. Now b5 strikes me as a little bit unusual in the sense of, like, isn't all the action happening over here? What are you doing playing b5? So, I mean, I would be tempted here just to play h3. If you play h3 here, again, where does this knight go? I don't see a safe square for the knight. I guess his idea again is he can give this up, and after take, now he can take this way, and it's with a check. So yes, it's an even trade, but we're now really feeling the heat. The other rook, at the very least, maybe you take here first, but the other rook is going to be coming in shortly thereafter, or even here. So yeah, I can see why now h3 doesn't work as well as when we had the rook back over here. So fair enough. Hang on a moment. How did we do this? Where were we? After b5, so h3 doesn't really work because of this move. It actually helps the knight get back into perhaps a better position than what it was before. Here you could still play something like this. I would maintain that this is probably still decent, although that drops the pawn. So probably not that move. Regardless, what does Tate play here? Does he want to bring the king up and do the moves I was thinking of before? I don't think so, because yeah, this knight is the one that's making all the problems. If this knight wasn't here, then h3 would be a big problem, because after this, you wouldn't be taking with check. With that in mind, Tate's move makes a lot of sense. What he plays here is actually knight b1. On the surface, looks like a strange move. It puts the knight back on its home square, but from its home square, it defends d2, and therefore the threat of h3 is now real. If black just continues with something random, then h3 is played, and after this you take, and there's no check because you simply take. And there, it's an easy win. So that's a very nice move, recognizing that h3 is almost a threat, but only not because of this knight hanging. Therefore, moving the knight away to a very safe square, but where it defends d2, and thereby we're now threatening h3. And what's black going to do about that? I would imagine black's going to want to make a hidey hole for this knight. So either move the bishop or perhaps move the pawn forward. And we can see that in the game he's moved the bishop. So now after h3, which is not played, but if it was played, the knight can drop back this way. So what actually was played? If it wasn't h3, well, I suppose the other option of attacking this knight was with king f3, and that was played here. The knight still has to drop back, so I assume it's going to... No, it doesn't drop back. He actually defends it instead. Okay, now h3 probably will be played, just to say, get your knight out of here. I don't like it here anymore. In fact, h3 is played. The knight has to drop back. And I think if it were me at this point, I'd be strongly considering moves like a rook fd1. Although you have to consider that he can double up his rooks there. So other moves that I would consider if this were me in this position. Honestly, it looks a little bit cramped now, as far as I can tell. Maybe rook f2. So if he doubles up, you really can't get the rook over here, can you? Takes. It's not working out nicely. So it seems like Sana actually really, the black pieces, really owns the d file at this point. So maybe I would try and claim ownership of the e file somehow. Maybe by rook fe1, and then look to push this in the future. Rook fe1 is played by Tate. Sana now doubles up on the d file. That's to be expected. But there's nothing really scary that they can do. If they come in here, we're just going to take the rook. If he comes here, we take the rook. Comes here, we take the rook. So maybe he can come here, I suppose. But, you know, despite owning the d file, it doesn't seem like it gives him a lot of an advantage. So what would I do here? Well, I suppose I would consider e5. e5 hits the rook. Problem doesn't work yet. After takes. We're hitting the rook, but we've opened our own king up a lot. Not only that, but let's say something like check for fun. Where do you go with this king? You might have to go somewhere like this. And then you've given up on the bishop, and this is a horrendous situation. So I wouldn't want to play e5 immediately, but what I might want to do, I want to double my own rooks, really. How do I do that though? Because if I play rook e2 straight away, he brings the rook down here, take, and then my knight comes up. That should be okay. But again, this bishop's sitting very, very pretty. Once this pawn moves, this bishop's going to look beautifully into the position. And if my knight happens to be sitting here in future, it could become, victim to a move like this, which could come with a tempo against a pawn and also hit. So, there's a lot of things now to be very aware of. So what does Tate play here? I think maybe what would I do? Maybe I would want to play. Well, again, I think rook e2 still makes sense, and then follow it up with rook h to e1. So just doubling on the e file. Doubling on the e file, if he does bring a rook down here, we can trade once and then play knight d2. Now, the only problem with that is that his rook here on d1 can then move to either c1 or a1, and thereby start pressuring these pawns. And it looks like he's going to win a pawn there, so I don't like that. I kind of don't like this position. This rook is just too locked in the corner of the board. And black owns the d file. So really, I have to say, I prefer black's position here, and I don't really like the position Tate has himself in. Yeah, moving the knight is what the computer says, and I guess it makes sense. Maybe with a knight here, you can justify a knight here as well, because the knights at least defend each other. And the computer says black is just marginally better. There's not much in it, but it's uncomfortable, I think. Now, what Tate played here, he actually played this rook e2 move, which I thought could be met by rook d1. So, but that's not what Sana plays. Now, I would have thought rook d1 here was nice. Just rook d1 attacks the rook. If the rook simply moves, well, then you take the knight, and that's not going to be any fun. And if you take the rook, as I was saying, you take back, you're hitting this knight. If the knight comes here, maybe a move like this can make sense immediately because you're attacking that knight. Although I guess there you can take, which is something that I missed. You can then go check. But even still, you don't have to play this right away. What I was also saying after this was, actually what I had said was that I was afraid of this because of stuff like this. I did miss that the rook would hang. So that's my own error. And I also said that after this, then something like this to attack the pawn, or something like this to attack the pawn would be annoying for white to deal with. That's why I didn't want it. But I suppose that you actually can get away with playing this rook c3 idea. and you should be okay. Again, the engine says it's basically equal. So it's not like it's wonderful for white, but all right, it works. Now the knight's attacked. I suppose you need to do something about that, and there's only one safe square for the knight at this point. There's only one safe square for the knight at this point, so you don't really want to use this square because you block this rook in again. It's a very uncomfortable position. But that's what's played, because what other choice have you got? Now we have rook d1. We're attacking this knight, and you know, that's uncomfortable. Maybe this knight can now jump to d2, because if it moves to d2, the knights defend each other. That probably is a sensible option. You can't do it with the other knight, because if you do this, your rook on h1 gets eaten. So I think that makes sense. But Tate actually does it this way, which very daring. Very, very daring, because he is tempting fate with moves like this in the future. Oops, I think I just overrode the actual game. We don't want to do that. But I suppose it works. So after this, he is immediately threatening this rook, and this rook has to move. So Sana now pushes it here. His rooks are now disconnected, which is interesting. But this knight, it appears, is pinned. And as long as this knight is pinned and can't move, then this rook is just hemmed into the corner, which is part of the reason I don't like this position for Tate. And what's coming next, or very soon, will be ideas like this. And after he taking this knight, and then once that knight is out of the picture, the other rook can come down and just put infinite pressure on this knight here. So it's looking a bit scary. And here, I think, comes the move that is beautiful. And I saw this just clicking through the game really quickly, but now we see it in its full context. In this move, in this position, the way Tate frees his position is really beautiful. He plays the move knight g3. Very nice move. Difficult to see because it puts the knight on a square that's apparently defended by a pawn. But of course, if you take the knight, then you lose the rook. And this pawn's going to fall shortly thereafter as well. And so therefore, you're freeing this rook up with a tempo against the other rook. This rook can't come in to help out, obviously, because you take, and if takes back, remember this knight, it's sitting very pretty indeed. So this move, this knight g3 move, seems like it was the key to free up the whole white position. So now Sana really has to just take, and after takes back, Sana's given what was a very active rook for what was a very inactive rook. And I think now Tate's position is much, much nicer, at least from a human perspective. Computer says it's basically still even, maybe ever so slightly in white's favor, but essentially even. But I would say from a human perspective, this is now a lot easier to play as Tate. Now, I think what I would do here is almost certainly knight f2, try and get my knight back into the game. That's played. Now he's attacking my knight. I probably want to defend that knight in some way, shape, or form. And there are a variety of ways to do that. Knight d1 seems to make a lot of sense. The knights defend each other. We're maybe threatening to play c3 in future if we want, or otherwise just relocate the knight to the e3 square. And then maybe later, somewhere else after that, maybe c5, c4, and if the pawn's captured, then the knight from c3 can come over here. So I think knight d1 would make a lot of sense, and that's played. Here he's attacking the other knight, but the knights, like I say, they do defend each other. But I think here, like I say, knight e3 probably makes sense. It probably also makes some sense to play knight d3 to attack his bishop. I think that move can also make a lot of sense here. Once the bishop moves, then knight c3 would also be, I think, perfectly good. You could think about e5 in this position, But a reason I don't like e5, very simply, is it allows the knight to jump into this square, which was previously guarded. So why give him that option? Tate plays knight d3, attacking the bishop. Makes a lot of sense. The bishop's going to have to move. And now I think I would either play c3 or just immediately knight e3. The benefit of c3 is it hits the bishop. But the downside is it puts the pawn on a square where it can possibly be attacked later. So I think what I would do is actually knight e3, and then on my next move, c4. And that's what Tate does. But we have to quickly look. Sana's pushed a pawn over here. What do we want to do about that, if anything? Or do we just proceed with c4, and if captures, we just take back? I think that looks relatively safe, so I think I would go with c4 here. No, Tate plays an unexpected move again. Unexpected. So I would have gone c4 here. And if takes, you can see that this knight now is very pretty. It can't be attacked by any pawn. This pawn structure is no good for black, and I just like that. So I think that would be nice, playing c4. If, however, he had taken, he gives up the bishop. So then let's say take, then he can take, and we both have sort of a ruinous pawn structure. So I can see that maybe that's why c4 is not so good, is because bishop takes is inserted first. But yeah, Tate plays this move knight f5, which allows a capture, which would seemingly ruin the pawn structure this way. So why did he allow this? I'm not sure. But Sana didn't do it. Sana went this way and allowed the capture of the bishop, which again, Tate didn't want. So we're going to have to think about this and try and understand these master level moves. Why not just capture the knight? Well, after take, what's the problem here for black? I mean, I don't see a problem here for black necessarily. I think black's very solid. Computer disagrees. Computer disagrees. Computer says this is the best move. What's the problem? We attack, whoops. We attack the bishop. I would think the bishop can just roll back. Take. Well, he doesn't want to take because we get a passed pawn. And this passed pawn is going to be a long-term issue. No, I'm not really understanding this. Now, this move, actually this is best for black. So somehow, something's gone very wrong in the last few moves for the black side. And I didn't mention this at the time, but I thought it was this whole bishop maneuver. Why did he do this bishop maneuver? When I was saying all along that his bishop here is lovely, all he needs to do is maneuver this pawn to move forward one day, and the bishop's going to come to life. But instead he moved the bishop back and then came all the way down here, and I kind of thought, what was the point of that? And in so doing, black has already undone all of his good work. White is already better here. And with the natural moves played, which we've already discussed, we get into this position where knight f5 is very good for white. Now, but I thought this was best for black, and it is. It is best for black. It's just that it's still not good. So why is this so good for white? Let's say he captures the pawn here. Well, we can just take back, and I guess we've just got an extra, we don't have an extra pawn, but this bishop, is it just that it's not doing anything? I don't understand what could justify a very large advantage here for white when the material, it seems, is equal. Now, I suppose you could argue that black's pawn structure is worse despite the equal material. Black's got doubled pawns here and two sets of isolated pawns here, whereas white's pawns are all together. Yes, there's a backward pawn here, but we can fix that problem, or at least we can hold that problem under wraps. And I guess it just turns out here to be very difficult for black. What would we do here as black is probably a good question. I think a natural move would be even something like this. But then I do see that this causes issues. Does cause issues, and very quickly we are converging on elements of black's position that black would rather not have to deal with, like always protecting this pawn. But I would have to say that this is now an end game where, the computer says one thing, but in reality, I think there are still practical chances for both sides. Now, with that said, we should just move on and keep on playing the best we can. So after this is played, well, actually it's not played. So black doesn't take the knight. Black instead retreats. And I guess now we're biased because we've already seen Tate's taken this pawn. But what would I do here? Well, I think as mentioned, I think I would have taken the bishop. And after takes back, then perhaps moving the king to e3 to attack the rook. Or is there something better? Now, in general, when you're simplifying into an endgame, which is basically what's going on here, we're choosing, do we want to take the bishop? We have to decide on which pieces are going to be the most useful in this endgame. Do we really want to take this bishop and give up a knight? Or do we want to keep the nice outposted knight? And I think in that context, it does make sense to keep this knight because black's bishop doesn't have any targets. And its mobility is restricted by its own pawns being on the same color as itself. So whereas this knight has lots of active options and really can't be assailed except for by the other knight, the bishop is probably worse than the knight for those reasons. So keeping the knight here makes a lot of sense. We already know he took the pawn here, so let's move on with life. What would I do here? We've got a passed pawn, which is a very, very good thing to have. We could just push it. There is an adage that passed pawns must be pushed. So I think e5 makes a lot of sense. It can't be stopped. So e5 is in fact played. He now tries to attack this pawn. We could possibly take the bishop now. And in fact, it looks like it's a free bishop. Am I not mistaken? Did he not just give up a free bishop? I think he did. So Tate takes it, and it looks like that was just a blunder. So a very interesting game. We'll click through it once more from basically the start. We had a Roy Lopez. Let me fix that screen size up. We had a Roy Lopez exchange with an immediate fianchetto of the queen's bishop, and then an opening of the center, capturing with that bishop, which was unusual. Fine, but unusual. And after this pin, which seeks perhaps to undermine the somewhat shaky defense of this bishop, we have a very tricky tactical defense, whereby we say, fine, you can take the bishop, we take queen, you take queen, we take your bishop, and then castles. Here I would have castled, but we have this immediate move, and then I probably would have here taken the bishop, but instead we jump back. And at this point, Tate's pieces are all seeming to become a bit crowded along the king side. A little bit crowded along the king side. I liked king e2. That made a lot of sense to me. Have to jump the knight back, no other choice. But here that we have to play rook d to f1, I really felt that white was very cramped here. And they were. And objectively, black was ever so slightly better. And I think here I would have done my move of king f3. Probably what I would have done, because here the rook is at least still free. And even if something like this is played, and take, as I mentioned, I think this is quite a lot better for white. The computer agrees that it's, I dare say, better than what Tate played in the game. Now, I'm not saying I'm an international master or anything. He was, but For whatever reason, he went with this, I think, much more awkward move. This was a nice move, which now threatens h3. We spoke about that at length. Now king f3, h3, rook e2, eventually played. But you can just see how tied up Tate was. But knight g3, well, firstly knight c3, attacking the rook, and then knight g3. That to me was the highlight of the game, realizing that that wasn't a real threat and that he was actually therefore able to free his position. And from here, things are once again comfortable for Tate. Not better, I don't think. At least not in this position. They're not better, it's basically even, but definitely more comfortable. And then it was really from here, what move is this that we're up to? This is move 27. From here, black essentially started to unravel themselves for Tate. By moving this bishop around, the position actually became better for Tate by default. And in this position here, Tate's a lot better. Just take and push the passed pawn. And then we had this move, which just blunders a bishop. So ultimately, again, black giving Tate the victory, more so than Tate earning the victory. But what I would say, it was an interesting game, and he maneuvered his pieces in something of a strange, unorthodox way that relied on tricky, interesting tactics. And I'd be keen to look at another one of these games in future. So there you have it. Thank you for the request. Keep them coming. If other people have other requests, put them in the comments. But that was Emory Tate, and we'll probably see some more from him in future. Thanks very much, and we'll see you soon.